very warm welcome to Arup. My name's Dave Richards. I'm one of the directors here in our buildings team. And well done for getting here on a rather unpleasant morning. It seems quite appropriate that we should do this event on a day in a season and in a year when arguably the impacts of climate change have been felt a bit more acutely. We're very delighted to host the UK GBC here for another event, and I think we're doubly delighted that it's such an important one. Zero carbon for non-domestic buildings is something that's very, very dear to our heart. Along with a number of you, we have co-signed the letter from the UK GBC to the Minister for Building Regulations, emphasising how important this piece of work is and emphasising how important it is that government take a strong stance and policy going forward. In particular, outlining the route map, the ideas around allowable solutions. So we're delighted to host everybody. This is a very important issue and a very important event. And I'm going to step aside and hand you over to the wonderful Paul King.
Thank you, Ben. And that was Dave Richards, the wonderful Dave. Good morning from the less wonderful Paul King. It's lovely to see so many of you here, and it's great to see such a fantastic diversity of people here. You can probably tell by looking around you that we've got people from right across the building's value chain, supply chain, as you will. And I think the reason for that is obvious, that this is a key piece of work. It stands in a long tradition of some fantastic pieces of work delivered through UK GBC task groups. And for those of you who are new to this, the important thing to emphasise is while some of my colleagues, and not least Joe Wheeler, have been hugely involved in supporting this group, this is about the industry, grappling with these issues for the industry, and that's what makes this bit of work so special. There are, of course, a number of thanks that I'd like to probably repeat several times, actually. The first is to thank Arup once again for hosting us in this space this morning. That's very, very kind of you. A couple of other people I'd like to sort of single out, really, although it's very much a team effort. Firstly, Sarah Cary from British Land, who's chaired this task group, who we'll be hearing from in a few minutes, I know has worked very, very hard on this, as Dan Jestico from Hilson Moran, who's coordinated the technical aspects, and again you're going to be hearing from Dan. But of course, all the members of the task group have worked very, very hard on this, and many of them long hours into the night, and last night was no exception, I know. And also, very big thanks to those members who sponsored this work and made it possible, and they were BAM, BRE, British Land, and Saint-Gobain. So thank you all very much for your support, the time and effort that you've put into this. It's a particularly significant task group, actually, this one, because it takes us right back to the very beginning of the Green Building Council. In May 2007, almost exactly 7 years ago, I was just with a couple of colleagues in the process of setting up the Green Building Council. Literally, we were sorting out a small office around the corner in the building centre. And I got a phone call from a senior official from CLG, who said, Paul, I know you know all about zero carbon homes and the Code of Sustainable Homes, because this was hot on the heels of the government's launch of those two policies. And I said, now we're wondering if we need to be thinking about non-domestic buildings along similar lines. Should we be thinking about trajectory for low or even zero carbon non-domestic buildings? And I said, yes, I think you should. And they said, well, we thought you might say that. So what we're going to do is we're going to go off and we're going to engage one of our big consultants to produce an evidence base to tell us how far and how fast it might be reasonable to go. And I said, well, I'll tell you what, could you give me, that is the Green Building Council, that bit of work? And they said, well, with respect, Paul, we know you from WWF and we know you've been involved in this, but really the Green Building Council doesn't have any track record. And I said, no, but look at our members, and our founder members included major consultancies, including the likes of BRE, Faber Maunsell, as they were then, now part of AFOM, but also major developers, major agents, investors, architects, engineers. And I said, what about if we get all of those people working together on this as a team? because what you get then is a much richer perspective. You'll get all sorts of different perspectives, not just the technical perspective on what is possible, that takes into account the real market. And I said, interesting. I said, I'll tell you what about if I get them to do it for no fee? And they said, you've got a deal, and you've got 5 months in which to do it. So I went back to the founder members and I said, I've got some good news, I've got some bad news. I said, the good news is we've got a fantastic project to make our mark as the Green Building Council. Bad news is you've got to do it for free, and there are a few intakes of breath, particularly from the consultants who may have won the work in the first place, I should add. And then they said, okay, let's do it. 5 months later, they produced a draft report, which I sat down and I read, and I was a bit taken aback. I was delighted with what it said, but it wasn't what I was expecting from this all-industry group, because it basically said that the government should regulate the trajectory for zero carbon buildings in about a decade. And I thought, I better sense check this. So I got the biggest developers in this country in a room together. There was British Land, there was Land Securities, there was Lendlease, there was Hermes, there were all sorts of major players. And I said, are you really going to sign up to this? Are you going to back this report into government? And they said yes. And I said, do you mind telling me why? Because it sounds a little bit like turkeys voting for Christmas. And they said, well, this is why we joined the Green Building Council. This is what it's all about. You know, this agenda is inevitable. It's much better that we're on the forefront, on the front foot, shaping the policy thinking, than having to deal with something that's been thought out by people who don't have experience in a few years' time. And that was the light bulb moment for me, and I suddenly realised, perhaps a bit late in the day, I realised the job I had and what we had as the Green Building Council. And when I took that message into the Minister, I saw she had a light bulb moment as well. And that began the story of the Green Building Council and zero carbon non-domestic building, because only 3 months later, one Gordon Brown stood up in the House and committed the government for all new buildings to be zero carbon in 2019. So it's been a fascinating period, and it is terrific today to come back to this story. In a way, it's a shame, of course, that we've not made more progress, and of course this is what this represents, an urgent call to action to keep us and get us back on track, really, with this target. And critically, that is coming from you, from the industry, not from the likes of me. And so what I want to do now is to hand over to colleagues, to Sarah initially, who's going to set out some of the... there we are. She's going to set out some of the key findings and recommendations of the task group. She's then going to hand over to Dan Justico, who's going to talk us through a bit more of the technical aspects of the route map that's proposed in the report. And then we're going to hear from a couple of other colleagues from the task group about some case studies, projects that they've been involved with, and how that relates specifically to the issues that we're discussing. And then we'll open it up for a panel discussion and Q&A with yourselves. So over to you, Sarah. Thank you.
Oh,
yes. Oh, good point. Yes, I reminded Joe just before I stood up that we'd forgotten to say, please do, if you have a signal, which I think you do, feel free to tweet with hashtag zero carbon. So hashtag zero carbon if you want to participate in a virtual discussion as well as a live one. Thank you, Sarah. Good. That's fine.
Thank you very much, Paul. I'm really glad to see so many familiar faces here this morning. I think some of us have worked on this policy off and on for ages, and so it's sort of encouraging to see the continued interest. I hope you find what we have to say interesting, and that you keep talking about it. If that's one message I would like to give to you, is please do share the findings of this report with your colleagues and with everyone else you come across in the industry. Paul's done a very good job of talking about some of the policy background of zero carbon in the non-domestic sector. I thought I would also mention that for those of you who aren't aware, we've got Part L 2013 kicking in a few weeks' time. It was launched, they consulted on a challenging option of either 10 or 20% aggregate improvement on 2010, and at the end of the day went for a 9% improvement. The last time a minister said anything about zero carbon 2019 in the non-domestic sector was in 2010. So we've had some consultation since then, but we haven't had a real recommitment to this, or indeed much interest at the civil servants level and sort of activity about what building regulations might mean for commercial buildings. As an industry, we still don't know what we need to build in 2 years' time on site, much less 5. And I can't stress that uncertainty enough, and we'll continue to make that point throughout the morning. So the purpose of the task group set about raising awareness about this inattention to policy, but also investigating and reconfirming why building regulations are good for economic and environmental reasons. We spent a lot of time discussing and considering the difficulties of achieving zero carbon in non-domestic buildings and what zero carbon might mean in a commercial context. So what does this mean about unregulated energy, the kind of metrics that you might see? And Dan will talk about the progress we've made in that area in just a minute. We set our work in a wider regulatory context. So you all know that there are a number of regulatory policy influences on energy in the commercial sector. We have feed-in tariffs, we have EPCs, we have the CRC, we have any number of acronyms which affect energy in the built environment. But we really thought as a task group, and we wanted to make this point again, that building regulations are a very appropriate regulatory tool. They set a minimum standard at the point of construction, which applies to everybody in the industry. It's a very clear signal, which all sorts of building types and users have to work to. Contrast this, for example, with financial incentives, which are in a sense optional, or taxation, which takes some time to transfer through the supply chain. So there's a sort of power inherent in a minimum standard for new building, which isn't there in some other forms of policy and regulation. I wanted to talk about 3 further topics we explored, which just to kind of set a bit more context for this. One is on actually the success of building regulations. We have a nice quote from Stephen Williams here, the current Building Regulations Minister, talking about how more carbon has been saved over the years through building regulations than from any other policy area in government. And I think all of those who participated in the task group felt that building regulations had been very successful in driving down regulated energy use. I've definitely seen that in our newer offices that we've constructed, but I think it applies equally to schools, to hospitals, to retail environments as well. We also talked about the policy development, so the current 1 in and 2 out rule about new policies, and I think I need to be very clear here, the way that this is working inside central government at the moment is that 2019 is a new policy, which was committed to and needs to be assessed on impact to industry. And that 1 in, 2 out means that if you bring one regulation in, you have to find 2 pieces of regulation which have one piece of regulation which has double the impact. So it's not actually the numbers of regulation, but it's the impact to industry. And so those impact assessments that you see, those lovely long documents at the back of a consultation, are very important in understanding how government is willing or views the way that regulation affects industry. The last thing that we discussed as a task group is that building, like the zero carbon policy is not, as I say, small beer. If you take the standards that were talked about 3 or 4 years ago, 20 or 40% or even further than that, these will be very challenging, if not technically impossible to do for some types of buildings. And we wanted to be very, as a task group, we thought, you know what, this aggregate approach works. It is going to be difficult for a number of buildings, but we think it's still valuable, and Dan will talk about that as well. The costs for allowable solutions that are being talked about for housing at the moment are not insignificant. They're about £2 a square foot if you do a kind of rough out middle of the road calculation. And while we can't translate that into non-domestic, because that consultation doesn't talk about non-domestic buildings at all, it starts to give a sense of the fact that we recognise that these are not small costs that we might have to deal with in 2 or 5 years' time. One of the strongest points that we discussed, and which we describe in the report quite a lot, is that building regulations affects a very wide spectrum of the industry. It is not both positively and negatively. So building users might see lower costs, building developers and contractors might see higher costs, but building designers, engineers, architects are going to have to invest in skills, and they're going to have to invest in time to understand building regulations, and in doing that, Building product manufacturers are going to have to invest in product innovation and in new skills coming forward, which could be a good thing or a bad thing. So there's a huge spectrum of the industry which is affected by building regulations. And to put that in perspective, the UK construction sector as a whole is 8% of the UK's GDP and employs about 2.5 million people. So if you think about the non-domestic sector, which is a very significant proportion of that number, you're looking at a large portion of the economy and also of employees in the UK economy that might have to deal with building regulations and a really challenging sector. So this is sort of significant in its scale. So when building regulations are understood as a policy tool which affects the entire supply chain for new buildings, the potential of zero carbon broadens beyond governance cost savings to innovation and green growth. This is the key point that we try and make in our report, both in the executive summary and in the letter which went out yesterday to ministers. A challenging set of building regulations we think will drive innovation in products and continue to grow UK corporate reputation for green buildings and carbon management internationally. For example, when product manufacturers like Saint-Gobain, and you'll hear from Emma at Lafarge in a second, see a market opportunity in future regulation, they'll invest in new production lines, installation skills, and alternative technologies. This in turn will actually bring my costs down when we build and bring down the costs for the rest of us. This will reduce that cost, as I said, and increase the export potential of UK green building knowledge to other countries. We'll go through some of the details that we have about this right now. There's a really lovely report by a DEC-biz industry research university collaboration group called the LCICG, which I'm not going to talk about explain, but what it sets out how energy efficiency in non-domestic buildings has an important role to play in meeting the UK's greenhouse gas emission targets, but also it describes the economic business case for energy efficiency regulation to drive innovation. And they've got some very strong numbers there about the potential export growth of being 1.7 billion to GDP by 2050, and large savings around £13 billion of avoided energy costs for the UK economy. In terms of export potential, we also describe in our report how we believe there's a real opportunity to strengthen an existing reputation. Everyone we talked to, and quite a number of members of the task group, had direct experience in sort of taking UK skills in this area abroad and making some money off of that. And I've got some with the endless quotes and endless case studies, and I'll explain one from the BRE in a minute. But we thought there was, by committing to a challenging standard, by delivering new buildings ahead of the European regulations, for example, if EPBD comes in 2020, if we're there a couple of years in advance, you'll have the rest of Europe looking to UK skills to meet their own targets. An example I wanted to give you this morning is the BRE's Innovation Park. In 2011, China's Vice Premier visited the park and found it really fascinating and interesting, clearly. And BRE were introduced to a very large real estate developer in China to set up an innovation park in Beijing. The FCO, UKTI, and a large number of UK businesses have been working on this to show and demonstrate UK potential over in China. I think it's as an anecdote, I think Dave Worthington from Camco showed up off the plane from a UKTI mission twice to our mission. So I think this is something which the task group members felt very personally very strong about, but also comes across in a lot of the research analysis in this, the industry analysis in this area. So with this in mind, I'm going to talk about our first three recommendations. The first two are that government should restate its very firm commitment to zero carbon non-domestic buildings from 2019 immediately. I added that word at the end. Secondly, that DEC, BIS and CLG, we don't just see building regulations as something which should be in communities and local government. It has an impact on energy and has an impact on businesses in the UK, as we've described. So all of those departments should work with industry to create a roadmap in 2019 and beyond, setting out the parameters of the zero carbon standard and enabling industry to invest in innovation and skills. I personally feel really strongly that the second recommendation is going to require a lot of money and time from the UK industry. We cannot expect government to sort of put up a lot of the upfront funding that it will take to develop a building regulation standard. But there's no point in doing that if we don't have political will and we don't have a very firm policy commitment to do that. So there's a bit of a challenge here to industry and a bit of a challenge to ministers and government as well. Our third recommendation is about the impact assessment methodology used by government to assess the economic costs and benefits of policy. And we suggest that this really needs to be revised to account for the broader range of impacts on UK PLC, which I've touched on today. We set these out in a lot more detail in our full report, and I'm not going to go through this, but it's quite a helpful summary to understand it, that at the moment, that impact assessment, which is used to decide how challenging regulation should be, only looks at the increased cost of, well, in the summary, it's not only this, but mainly looks at an increased provision of renewables on site as a cost to builders and developers against reduced operational costs and reduced operational carbon emissions. We actually think that both the costs and the benefits are much broader than this and relate to the whole industry, as I described this morning. And I think the strongest message that we got from this is that there is a very strong economic case for establishing a robust definition of zero carbon for non-domestic buildings, and that moving now is incredibly important to be able to deliver, but not only the first mover advantage, but to give the industry time to prepare. So I'm going to hand over to Dan, who's going to talk about what we mean by zero carbon.